For the last video of the year, I thought I'd talk about how the world economy has changed over the past decade. So this is a map of how rich and developed each country was in 2010, and this is a map of how rich each country is at the beginning of 2020. So by comparing them, you can see how countries' level of income has changed over the past decade. And I thought, since I have the two maps, I'd compare them. So as you can see here, there's some writing. Just ignore that. This is just left over from the template I used to create the maps in the first place. But it's a good template to use because it has all the countries together, so I could just click on the countries and change the colors quickly because they're all attached to each other. You can see their lines here. So anyway, starting with Latin America, you can see that a lot of the countries have gotten a little more developed over the past decade. Now, Brazil has only grown a little bit because the country had become over-dependent on commodities, and when the bottom fell out of commodity prices this decade, Brazil's economy cratered. So its economy only grew a very small amount over the decade, and it's done absolutely horribly since 2014. Something vaguely similar happened in Argentina, although the economy grew a bit more than Brazil. I've made two videos talking about Argentina's economy specifically, by the way, so if you want to know more about that, you can watch those. Though in some cases, they're the same color, countries that stayed the same color actually grew more because they were only just above the threshold of that color, and they grew to a point just below the threshold of the next color. While conversely, countries that changed color in some cases only grew a little bit, but they grew just enough to get over the threshold. So just because a country changed color or doesn't change color doesn't always mean it grew more or less than a country that stayed the same color. So I'm just putting it out there. So if I subsequently say a country that changed colors grew a little bit and a country that stayed the same colors grew more, you understand why that's happening and not a complete contradiction to what's on the map. So now that I've gotten that out of the way, you can see that Venezuela's economy completely imploded over the past decade. Probably everyone's aware of that. I'd say the biggest reason is the price controls. So if you set the price control to a good below the cost of production, then of course no one's going to produce that good. And then all the producers that depend on that good further down the supply chain can't find components anymore, so they also stop production and the economy completely seizes up. So Colombia's economy hummed along and grew a little bit, but in the second half of their decade the growth slowed because they were also affected by the slowdown in commodity prices. Chile's economy also grew a bit, as did Uruguay's. Panama was probably the best performer in Latin America. The economies in Central America grew a little bit, but from a pretty low base for the Americas. Mexico's economy grew a little bit, but only just enough to pass the threshold to the next color. Again, I've just made a video explaining why Mexico's economy has performed so relatively poorly, so if you're really interested in that country specifically, you could look at that video. And I think that's the Americas. So moving on to Europe. In Western Europe, there aren't many changes on the map, both because they're all already developed countries, and that's the highest grade I'm using for the color system on my map. But it's also because most of Europe hasn't grown that much in the past decade. So Europe's economy has performed miserably over the past decade, and that's because of the euro crisis and Germany's overdependence on exports. So I guess the Western European economy that has had the best performance has been Sweden, though that's economy's been a complete outlier in the rest of Western Europe. Even right next door, Denmark and Finland have done a lot worse. I'd say right at this moment, France's economy is doing better than Germany's, but over the past decade it's performed significantly worse, so if France's economy is doing quote-unquote well, it's only a decade bounce. And even then, like, growth of a little over 1% isn't really spectacular. So in Eastern Europe, there's been steady growth over the decade, as you can see by how much the incomes of those countries increased. Turkey's also performed decently. So like a bunch of countries in Eastern Europe have reached being developed countries. Because of overdependence on oil exports, Russia's economy has not performed as well as the Central European countries and the Eastern European countries further west. So there hasn't been that much growth in the Middle East. That's probably partly due to the instability of the Arab Spring, though there are probably other, I guess, quote-unquote secular factors that are also contributing to the slower growth of that region. The best economic performers in sub-Saharan Africa have been Ghana, Nigeria, and Sudan. And Sudan is the most northern African type of country in the area. So other countries like Guinea, Senegal, Tanzania, and even Zimbabwe have grown a little bit. The rest of the continent has been almost stagnant. So Yemen specifically has gotten a lot poorer because of the civil war. So has Syria, but it was more developed for longer, so that's what's making Syria a little bit different. So over the past decade, China has grown a lot. It already built up its economy substantially and become the factory of the world by 2010, but their economy continued to steadily grow through the 2010s, so now they're like substantially higher than where they were at the beginning of the decade. Japan has had lackluster growth over the decade, while Korea and Taiwan have grown more steadily, but again, that's not shown on the map because they were already at the highest level color I have on the map. So Thailand's grown a bit from a fairly high level, and Myanmar, Vietnam, and Laos have grown a lot more from a very low level. Pakistan's also grown a similar amount, and India has had the best performance of any large country, growing, I think, one of the most over the past decade. Sri Lanka and Bhutan have grown a little bit more, but they're small countries. So Malaysia has also grown significantly and become a developed country. The Philippines has grown a steady amount, though not as much as India because it was at a higher level back in 2010. And Indonesia has also grown a fair bit. I think Australia's economy has done decently over the past decade, but I haven't been paying the absolute closest attention to Australia because it's a country that's already developed, and it's so far away from everything else. So going back to Africa, you can see that Southern Africa was already a little bit more developed than the rest of Sub-Saharan Africa, but over the past decade, their economies have not grown at all, so some Central and Western African countries have caught up a little bit. I think the last region to talk about is Central Asia. Again, Iran, like the rest of the Middle East, has not performed that well over the past decade. But Central Asia has performed pretty decently. So Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan have grown a fair amount, and Kazakhstan has pretty much grown the same amount as Russia. So as you can see, those two countries are fairly more grown than they were back in 2010. So I think using my two maps, I've given a fair summary of how the world economy has changed over the past decade. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel, hit the notification bell, like the video, and share this video with anyone you think might be interested, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Thanks.